Okay, so I'm about to replace the wheel bearings on my bike. It's a TRX850, but I have a YZF750 swing arm and rear wheel on it. So when you're replacing wheel bearings, the first thing you need to do is establish, obviously, do your bearings need to be replaced. Now it's pretty easy to test your rear wheel bearings or even your front wheel bearings. Easier certainly than checking your swing arm bearings. I'll show you my rear wheel because my rear wheel bearings are in need of replacement. My rear disc is also in need of replacement, as you can probably see from this picture. Anyway, to check if your rear wheel bearings are in need of replacement, what you need to do is jack the rear wheel off the ground. I've just used a paddock stand, as you can see here, and just take the wheel and try and move it basically from side to side. Now you can hear in that wheel there's a bit of a knock. Basically tells me there's a bit of a play in the bearings, and therefore they need to be replaced. So first thing you need to do is ascertain what bearings you need to buy to replace your bearings. You can probably find your bearing numbers on the internet. If you can't, just take your wheel off and you'll see, first off you'll see a bearing seal there. So you can see the seal here. So that seal is useful because it's got a number on it that tells me the size of the bearing seal I need to replace. And if I pull that seal out with a screwdriver, I'll show you how to do that shortly, you'll see the bearing number on the bearing itself. Obviously the same applies on the other side. In this case you've got a sprocket carrier with a sprocket carrier bearing and seal. Once you take the sprocket carrier off, you'll see the wheel bearing in there. Again, the size will be written on the wheel bearing. So I've bought my bearings this morning and my seals, and you can see I've bought the two wheel bearings here because I don't need to replace my my sprocket bearing, and two oil seals because it's always good to replace oil seals when you replace bearings. So you can see here on my oil seal it's got some numbers on it. In this case I have 35, 52 and 8. What that tells me is the inside diameter of this seal is 35 mm, the outside diameter is 52, and the width is 8 mm. Similarly, I've got my new bearing here, or one of my new bearings here, and again this has a number on it. A little bit tricky to see on this camera, but the number here is 60/28 or S. So what that tells me is it's a 60/28 is the bearing number, and ORS tells me it's a shielded bearing. So now I'm going to get on, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the rear wheel off the bike and drive the old bearings out. Okay, so as you can see here now, I've taken the rear wheel off my bike. Here it is on the ground. Now what we have on this wheel is, on this side we have our sprocket and sprocket carrier. On the sprocket carrier here you can see we have a bearing seal, and underneath that is a bearing. Now if I take this sprocket carrier out, it just lifts out. So if I take this sprocket carrier out, you can see there's the back of the bearing inside the sprocket carrier. Again, that has some numbers on it. Now I'm not replacing that bearing, but I am going to replace the oil seal on the other side because it's a little bit tired, and I'll show you that in a moment. Inside the wheel here we can see there's the first wheel bearing that's going to be replaced, and if I turn the wheel over I can see there's an oil seal here, and underneath that is a second bearing. Now I'm just going to remove this oil seal. Now in my case I'm going to replace this oil seal, so I don't need to be terribly careful when I'm removing it. But if you're not going to replace the oil seal, be careful when you take it out. Just make sure you use a nice flat screwdriver with a nice wide head on it to minimize the amount of damage you do to the oil seal when you pull it off. To take the oil seal off is pretty straightforward. As I say, I just take my flat screwdriver and I'll slide it underneath the oil seal and just lift it out. You can see there's the oil seal that's popped out. Now I'm going to replace that, so I don't need it. and there's the second bearing under there that's got to come out. So it's quite greasy or quite rusty and needs to be replaced. I'm just going to take this sprocket carrier over here, and I'll take my flat screwdriver. So as I said, I'm not actually going to replace the bearing in this sprocket carrier, it's quite good. But I have bought a replacement oil seal, so I'm going to replace that. First thing I do is take this existing oil seal out, and it's the same process as before. I just slide my screwdriver under it and just pull it out. Okay, so that's that oil seal out, and I don't need that anymore. I have a replacement one here to go in. So before I go in, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to clean up this area, and I'm going to put some new grease in there, and then pop the new oil seal in. So I'll just clean that up now. Okay, so I'll just use a rag just to wipe away what's here. And just give it a bit of a clean. Now you can check this bearing while you have it out. Just basically spin it, and it should spin freely and there should be no noise. So this bearing's in nice good condition. I should say at this point, actually, when you're buying bearings, don't buy cheap bearings. It's a terrible waste of money. Good bearings aren't actually that expensive. You probably pay 30 Australian dollars for a good Japanese bearing. This bearing in here is a Nachi bearing. I don't know if you can see that. That's Japanese made. The bearing I'm putting in the wheel is a Koyo bearing. Again, it's a good quality bearing. About $30. There's cheaper bearings available, presumably out of China. Look, they're not terribly good. They're not as well made. Bearings have to be made within very fine tolerances. It's a reasonably expensive manufacturing process, so you can't expect them to be too cheap. So next thing I'm going to do here is I'm just going to apply a nice new layer of grease. I'm going to put a little bit of grease around the edge of my new oil seal, and I'm just going to push that oil seal in. Okay, so here we are. I've just put some new grease on that. I'm just using just a lithium grease. Taken my new oil seal here, and I've just put some grease on the inside of that. It's a bit messy on the outside, but I'll clean that up after, and just put a little bit of grease around the edge just to ease it in, make it easier to put in. So I just pop that over and just push it down with the palm of my hand. And you'll feel that seat in there. And that's that job done. That's the oil seal replaced in my sprocket carrier bearing. So what I'll do is I'll just wipe that with a cloth just to get rid of the excess grease, and I'll put that aside to go back in the bike. So next step here is to remove the old bearings. Now there's a couple of ways you can do this. Most definitely the simplest way to do is if you have a bearing puller, which is basically a slide hammer arrangement with a socket that fits inside this bearing. What you can do is just pull it out using the bearing puller. I don't have a bearing puller, so what I'm going to use is I'm just going to use a drift. So tire iron is good for this, or a decent sized old screwdriver. What you want to do is take your drift. I'll see if I can show you in here. Inside this wheel hub we've got obviously is the bearing. Then there's a tube here which moves around, and the axle sits in that tube. So this tube can move around inside. What I can do is if I take my drift and push it down here, I can move the bottom of that tube to the side, and what it'll do is it'll expose the edge of the bearing at the opposite side of the wheel. It's difficult to show you this on the camera. I'll use my finger from the other side and see if I can show you. Okay. I'll just flip this wheel over and show you on the bearing on that side. Okay, so if you look inside this wheel, I can see that tube, and off to the side there you can see the edge of my bearing. So what I can do is I can use my drift to get some purchase against that edge and basically bang it with a hammer. And what I do is I move it around, so I'll bang this side first, then I'll bang the opposite side, then I'll move to the edge there and bang there. And what I'm trying to do is basically just work the bearing out with force. It's an interference fit. And if you're finding this job very tough, what you can do is you can apply a little heat to the hub around here. What that'll do is that'll cause that hub to expand slightly and make it a little easier for you to punch your bearing out. Okay, so you can see here I have a butane torch. What I'm just going to do is I'm just going to heat the edge of this rim around the bearing there. Obviously this process will pretty much destroy the bearing by way of it's going to melt the seal and it's going to cause the grease inside the bearing to run out. Now I don't mind because I'm replacing this bearing, but this process of heating the hub causes the hub to expand. So then when I flip this wheel over and punch this bearing out with my hammer and drift, it'll be a little bit easier because the hub will have expanded, making it easier for the bearing to come out. So a little bit of heat and some taps from the other side of this bearing with the hammer. I heated the hub here, which caused the hub to expand, and then I banged the back of this bearing from the other side of the wheel, and it's just popped right out nice and easy. Heating the wheel or heating the hub really makes it much easier for the bearing to come out. It's the same reason we cool the bearings by putting them in the freezer before we put them back in. By putting the bearings in the freezer, we cause the bearing itself to contract very slightly, which means it'll drop in to the hole much easier. When we put it back together, we can, if we like, also heat the rim, which will cause the rim here to expand, cool the bearing, and it'll just drop in. It'll make it much easier to put that bearing in. Anyway, that's that first side bearing out. So I'll put that to the side. I can take the this piece inside the wheel out. So this piece here, basically it's part of the bearing, I suppose, but the axle runs in the middle of this. This sits inside the hub. Now I'd like to see a bit of grease around this, and just grease is good. It expels water and keeps everything nice and clean. And there's been no grease in this particular one. I'm not sure if these bearings have ever been replaced before, but when I put it back together I'll grease it all up. So now I have that bearing out. I can see the back of the bearing on my other side. I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm just going to take a drift here, slide that in against the end of the bearing, which you can see there, and then just bang this drift with a hammer, and that'll push that the bearing out of the other side. Okay, so now with that second bearing out, you can really see that this this bearing's pretty mucky and grubby. Most likely the reason it's grubby is that the ball bearings inside this bearing have rusted a bit, and that rust has made the grease dirty. Now you can see here I can't actually turn this bearing easily, and when I do turn it, it's very rough. This bearing is knackered and needs to be replaced. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to clean everything up. I'm going to clean all this grease and muck out of here. I'm going to clean the axle shaft there that I've taken out of the bearing, or taken out of the hub. I'm just going to put a nice layer of grease all around here and just prep for the new bearings, which are still in the freezer. This wheel hub is now being cleaned up, so I cleaned inside the hub and removed all the old dirt and grease and any grit that was in there. What I've done there is I've just put in some new lithium grease. Obviously it's a little bit messy. I'll clean that up once I'm finished. But basically I've just put a nice layer of grease inside the hub itself, which will stay in there as the bike runs, and just put a little bit of grease on the hub here. Just it'll help the bearing slide in easier. Now to put the bearing in, what I'm going to do is obviously I'm going to just heat that hub a little bit before I start, and as you know, I have the bearings in the freezer. I also have this here. So basically, this is just a piece of threaded bar with just a metal plate on the end. Now, this is useful because what I can do is I can slide this through the hub from one side, and that metal plate will brace against the hub. Then flip it over to the other side, and I have my threaded bar sticking out there. So what I will do is I'll take my new bearing and I'll pop it in there. Then I'll take my old bearing and drop it on top of the new bearing like that. And I'll just use a large socket there in the end. What I'll do is I'll basically just tighten a bolt down this piece of threaded bar, and as that bolt tightens, it'll push on this socket, which in turn will push on the old bearing, which in turn will just drive the new bearing into the wheel. It's very important when you replace a set of bearings that you don't impact the inside race of the bearing here. The outside race is what you will use to knock the bearing into the hub. If you hit the inside race, what you'll do is you'll basically damage the inside of the bearing and shorten its life or destroy it completely. So you can see there, I'll get the new bearing out of the freezer. Once I've heated up this rim, I'll sit it on there like I have with this old bearing. I'll put the old bearing on top, I'll put the socket on top, and then I'll run a bolt down this piece of old thread and tighten it, and basically tightening it will push that new bearing into the hub squarely. So my new bearing is in the wheel now. Basically what I've done is, as I said, I've tightened it down with this bearing until it's met the rim. Then because this bearing sinks past the rim, what I need to do is I need to take a large socket like this. Large socket is useful because it allows me to put the bottom of the socket here against the edge of the bearing. I can then push it in there and tap with a hammer, and basically move it around and tap it and tap it and tap it until I get the bearing in nicely and seated against the inside here. You'll hear the sound will change once the bearing is seated properly, the sound when you bang the hammer. Right, so with the bearing on this side done, the new bearing installed and ready to go, I'm ready to flip the wheel over and install the bearing on this side. Very important to remember before you install this bearing to put your hub back in. If you don't, you'll be in a whole heap of trouble, not least because you won't be able to get the hub in after you've installed the bearings. So put the hub in and then move on and install your second bearing. Same again, heat the rim slightly, take your new bearing out of the freezer, pop it on top and compress it in using the piece of old thread with the bolt against it. Look, you don't have to use a piece of old thread. What you can do is you can take this bearing, place it on top of your new bearing, this is the old bearing, place it on top of your new bearing, and hammer around the edge of this bearing. That'll transfer the force to the edge of the new bearing, and you can use the old bearing to install the new bearing that way, just with a hammer rather than using a piece of threaded bar. Unfortunately I can't show you this in action because I've nobody to hold the camera, so I'm just going to go ahead and install the bearing on this side. So that's that second bearing in, and the last thing I need to do is just install my new oil seal. So just put a little bit of grease in around the bearing there, and a little bit of grease inside my oil seal here, and just pop it on just with pressure from my palm and my thumb just to push that oil seal home. And that's it. That's bearings done. Okay.